Welcome to the Wheel of Time Diaries. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we are doing technically the second week of my reading of Path of Daggers, the 8th book in the series at this point, but with the caveat being that this video is actually being recorded before the first episode even comes out, which is very abnormal for this series. I never really do that, and normally I do the multiple weeks of Wheel of Time Diaries in accordance with my actual reading for the week. Sure, I do a tiny bit of planning ahead of time to somewhat kind of organize how I typically structure these videos, like making sure that I get through, generally speaking, a POV section all of the way before I do one of these, so that I'm not like getting through, say, like half of a Rand portion just to start reading the next week and have 2 more chapters in there, because at this point in the series, Jordan typically structures the POV allocations and everything within the series so as to see, you know, the little mini arcs within a book of a character having some sort of like actual arc to it, to justify having all of those POV chapters like at once. Basically, might have like secondary or auxiliary POVs that kind of interrupt that flow a little bit at times, but usually never anything to really take away, and more so to usually add to that POV. So while I plan ahead a little bit of my reading as far as the weeks go, normally it is a full week's worth of reading, and I'm just like, okay, I'm gonna read like these chapters this weekend, and that's what I cover in the diary. This time, like I said, I'm actually covering a good bit more than that. You'll see I have a couple bookmarks in here. One of those is where I'm currently at, and one of those is the actual checkpoint for the end of the 3rd week of reading, because spoiler alert, I didn't just read the 2nd week's worth of reading. I've actually already started on a little bit of what's going to be covered in the 3rd week. On account of having so many videos done ahead of time, the 4 diaries for Path of Daggers were kind of, you know, hard set in my schedule, and deciding to cover a lot more both complicates like the videos themselves, making them even longer somehow than these videos are managing to be, against my own my own best wishes, we'll say. But also because, like I said, I just don't have the time or the ability really to fill in the gaps of those videos, just to come up with something else to do, and there's other technical stuff behind the scenes. So I'm like, I'm just going to do the 4 diaries like normal and just split the book into quarters and try to read the book as quick as possible, because time-based reasons I have for doing that. And it's actually been going really, really good. I gotta say, the 2nd week's worth of reading, which if you saw the title and or thumbnail, you would know that we're covering chapters 7 through 14 of the Path of Daggers this week. I've actually read all the way through chapter 17 at the time of recording this. By the time of this video's release, I'm probably done with the book. So that's kind of putting into perspective the way that things are going right now. At the time of the first video's release, the first diary for this book coming out, I may or may not be up through like chapter 20 or something along those lines. But the point is, I've read a lot pretty quickly in this, and it's actually been great. While I confessed in last week's video, the first diary for Path of Daggers, that I was feeling a little bit more mixed on Path of Daggers, relatively speaking, at the beginning, because most of that beginning is the prologue wasn't as exciting as prologues tend to be, at least in like the vein that Robert Jordan tends to write them. It didn't feel super mind-blowing or earth-shattering to any degree to really say like, oh yeah, that was a great prologue. It just kind of existed. Most of that information feels like it's just kind of hanging out in my brain at this point, ready to be utilized whenever it is that Jordan sees fit to utilize, but that's about the extent of it, rather than revealing some massive bit of information that's like, oh, that like actually transforms something that we already knew about, or really heavily foreshadows like some big reveal to come or something. Like it wasn't anything along those lines, at least not to my experience anyway. And the first 6 chapters were just wrapping up the most major hanging thread from the end of A Crown of Swords, and the way that felt at the beginning of a book just seemed off. Like the pacing of that felt off. I would also say a couple of those chapters were maybe a little bit bloated, didn't need to be as long as they were. Those 6 chapters could have probably been 4 chapters and not really lost very much, just with a little bit of trimming. So I was pretty mixed on the beginning of the book, but everything for this second week's worth of reading, chapters 7 through 14, honestly, aside from like a couple minor moments, I've really enjoyed myself. So starting off in a more spoiler-free context, let's say that I read not quite 7 hours this week, but enough time to get my total reading to a little over 13 hours at this point. So my first week and this second week are pretty comparable, and I think that the third week will probably be a little bit longer than both of these. The fourth week will probably be a little bit closer to the first week's worth of reading in accordance to time. So like I said, I've been getting through pretty quick. I've already read 2.5 hours into the third week's worth of stuff, but this week it's just the nearly 7 hours here. So again, covering chapters 7 through 14. To start things off here, like I said in the spoiler-free context, let's say that last week I was kind of wary about going into this next week worth of reading because of moving into what seemed to be a fairly lengthy portion of Perrin POV, and anybody who knows my feelings on the series, just kind of repeating what I've said at the end of last video, is that I'm not the biggest fan of the Perrin storyline, because a lot of the Perrin storyline has Zareen inherently kind of tied in there, and she's my least favorite character of the series. I don't really like her very much, and whenever she's around, she tends to bring Perrin's character down in my mind, make him less enjoyable for me, which I get a little bit salty about, because Perrin was my favorite character for the first 3 books, and not my favorite character at this point in the series at all, just because of Zareen existing and the relationship with her. So I went into the first 4 chapters of this reading, so chapters 7 through 10, kind of went in wary, like I said. I went in not sure how things would go, not sure how I would feel, kind of anticipating that I would probably not be a fan, or that I would have to kind of force my way through these 4 chapters just to get to some stuff afterwards. I was pleasantly surprised to find that basically the entirety of this Perrin storyline here at the beginning of the beginning of the book, I would say like the beginning of the book proper, so like the actual start of the arc of this book, rather than finishing off something that was coming before, I really enjoyed it. Again, outside of like a handful of somewhat eye-rolly type moments, I really enjoyed this stuff. I found the storyline to actually be engaging to follow. I found the actual character interactions to be pretty good. I didn't find there to be any super major annoyance between Perrin and Zareen actually having a couple of brief POVs during this section as well is expanding a little bit of her side of the story in a way, not necessarily like the backstory of things, but more like things she's doing actively right now, say unbeknownst to Perrin, which is really expanded kind of the dynamic there, that I'm like, that's actually pretty interesting. I'm kind of keen to see what's going on there. Of course, I'm still worried about it because I've heard horror stories about, these couple of books being the worst of the storyline, but even so, I'm going in like pretty optimistic, cautiously optimistic at that, but pretty optimistic. Following these 4 Perrin and Zareen chapters, you have a couple chapters of a lot of miscellaneous POV stuff, which I might cover at the end of this video, because, there's a little bit to go into there that I think is worth discussing, like at the end of a video type of thing. But then again, I might not. I don't know precisely what I'm going to do. But then after those 2 chapters, you have a couple chapters of actual Rand stuff in here, which up to the point that I'm currently at is the only Rand that I've read in the book. 2 chapters there, which seems to be setting up something pretty major, and like maybe that's an understatement, but like really major to come with this storyline, like more or less imminently at the time of where I'm currently at in the reading. I only have like a few chapters before we circle back around to Rand stuff in here, and there's going to be a few chapters of it, and I think that that's going to be some pretty big stuff. And there's also some dynamics going on with Rand in there that I find to be cool and like really interesting and a little bit new for the series, and kind of taking things in a new direction. So things are looking up. I've really enjoyed my reading this week, like a lot, really. Like I don't really have any other words for it. I just actually really enjoyed it, and surprisingly so. Again, I was not anticipating to like really enjoy the Perrin POV section, but there was a lot to enjoy about it. So things are looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and actually discuss now, talking about chapters 7 through 14 of The Path of Daggers in a spoiler condition now. So if you haven't read those chapters explicitly, I suggest you click away now. And if you don't, you're kind of a crazy person. Even so, there's a lot to get through this week. This video is probably going to be really long, and I apologize for that. No one hates it more than I do. So let's just jump in. Chapters 7 through 10 being the Perrin Zareen stuff going on. So chapter 7 opens up with a group of, let's say, actually, backtracking a little bit, in A Crown of Swords, about halfway through or so, Rand kind of has a fit of rage with Perrin and sends him away to kind of go do a political task away from Carrion. And that's what the group has kind of done. Perrin and Zareen with, I guess at least a handful of Ashaman. I don't know precisely how many Ashaman are with them, but all of them, plus Barrelane and some of the other, what's the country called? Mayonnaise. I don't know the term off the top of my head, but some Mayene army. Like, Perrin has a solid amount of army with him, but it's basically him and Zareen and some Ashaman, and Barrelane is more or less like the main crew that has kind of jumped over to a part of the world more on the west side. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they are in Galen, and they're not near Johanna, the capital, but they are around another place called Bethel. And what they're doing here is Perrin and like the group is basically kind of, outside Bethel, just observing it from afar. Deliberations about who to send as an appeal into Bethel to, basically make the terms for a potential allyship between Rand and the queen of the area, named Alliandre, who had sent a letter to Rand at one point, suggesting potential allegiance with him, or perhaps possibly fealty to Rand. Barrelane and her Aes Sedai advisor are the ones that Perrin ultimately chooses in this chapter to go and make that kind of appeal to the queen, sending them into Bethel. So that's what happens in the chapter. They seem to be led inside from afar. The rest of the group that are been kind of observing the city up to that point decide to go back to the main camp of the army. They head back north that direction. While heading north, they come across some of the Prophet's men. So if you remember, like, the Dragonsorn being a more or less like major plot point in like the Fires of Heaven, especially over here in like the sort of southwest-ish region of the continent. The Prophet, I forget his name off the top of my head. I know it's in here and I have it written down in several places, but when you're reading so much and have so much information jam-packed into your head, specifics like names like that can sometimes get pretty hard. I have a hard time remembering the main characters' names sometimes. But yeah, so the Prophets, there are some of the Prophet's men doing what the Prophet's men do, what the Dragonsworn, the quote-unquote Dragonsworn, do around in the region, kind of like terrorizing people in the name of the Dragon Reborn, and just kind of general quasi-lawlessness, we'll say. Some of the Prophet's men seem to be harassing what appear to be a group of travelers. Perrin and the others save these travelers in this chapter, capturing one of the Prophet's men. In doing so, the Prophet's man that they've captured says that he is the Lord Dragon's servant, like the whole Dragonsworn type of thing. But Perrin threatens him because, of course, he's not actually Rand's servant directly. Perrin is a servant of Rand in this context, and says so to the man, despite the fact that, they wanted to be a little bit more, let's say, hidden about the way that they're entering Galen, like wanting to maybe be able to sneak up on the Prophet, who I have written down here, I guess is named Massima. Perrin has the Prophet's man basically go back and tell Massima personally that, Rand's actual men are around the area. So much for their cover that's blown now, but that's an interaction that occurs. We'll see what happens with that. The travelers that they saved, however, are actually Morghese and Linny and the rest of that crew they're in, with Morghese being called a different name in this context. I don't actually know for sure how to pronounce that name, like Magdin. I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm probably just going to call her Morghese indefinitely because it's easier for me to remember, and, because that's who she is. I'd rather call the characters by their real names, generally speaking. Perrin recognizes two of the accompanying men as people from Caemlyn and otherwise from Andor who he has met before, and intends to speak with them at some point, but these two accompany the group basically, and they all make it back to the camp. Perrin also notes that Morghese, that the character hidden must be more than a simple countrywoman by some of the ways that she behaves, which of course is true. She's been the queen of Andor for forever until she renounced that title whenever her last POV was in A Crown of Swords, which I think might have been, I don't know, like 2/3 of the way through, or maybe even earlier than that, something like that. So that's more or less what happens in Chapter 7. I would say, as a side note that I wrote down here, everybody in Perrin's clan, it's something that's noted in the chapter, everybody in Perrin's clan kind of noticed that both sides of magic, of the one power, had been, used to some significant degree a few days prior, which, seems to very heavily suggest the Bull of the Winds, which of course used both sides of the magic, to kind of close some things off. And because Perrin has some Aes Sedai around and also some Ashaman around, both of them were able to kind of tell and distinctly feel that, say like, hey, this is something that happened. We should maybe be worried about that. Nothing seems to really come of it, at least not at this point in the chapter. But then you move into Chapter 8, where Perrin and co. return to their camp with Morghese and the rest of that group. Morghese seems to be quite visibly upset with the display of the Manetheren banner, because she sees it as kind of like a rebel flag, a rebel banner from, the very far edges of her kingdom, or her previous kingdom, which seemed to come across as like a sort of rebellion against, the actual throne that she sat upon. Perrin does not fully realize that Morghese was once the actual queen of Andor, and kind of has to like defend it in a way, and I would say in a way that actually worked pretty well in his defense. It tended to be pretty good, but after some bickering about the banner and some other stuff about ruling and stuff like this, Zareen decides to take the women from the group to go clean and wash up. Perrin decides that he wants to have a chat right now with Basil Gill from the Inn of Caemlyn. So, the men that he recognized from the group. While he's meeting with these people, Linny kind of interrupts that discussion. She and Gil kind of together tell Perrin a made-up story that the reason that Gil was found around this area was because he had the opportunity to import some wine that he could sell at his inn, and that he met the others on the road just kind of while traveling, more or less incidentally, and that they've been chased around by dangers kind of all over the place to wherever was safe, rather than going any one specific direction, which, to some degree is more than likely, at least not necessarily a blatant lie. At least some of it's not a blatant lie, like maybe running away from dangers or stuff like that could very well be true. Perrin, either way, seems kind of suspicious about some of this stuff for pretty obvious reasons, because Gil's acting very suspicious, and Linny kind of prompting a lot of this kind of, exacerbates that issue. Perrin's suspicious about all this, but he doesn't quite know why they would lie to him either. He doesn't have a particular motive. He doesn't interpret a motive from them, like, why would they like lie to me about this? So I guess I'll believe them, but something about this doesn't really add up. But after the meeting, after learning this information, like this false story of what's going on, Perrin returns to Zareen, who has, at the time when he enters, is parting amicably with Morghese, having basically let Morghese agree to be a servant of hers, a lady's servant, since Zareen is the lady to Lord Perrin, the leader of this band, this army over here in the West. And Zareen and Perrin decide together that although Perrin doesn't actually like the Manetheren banner, and, alongside being called Lord and other stuff like this, he doesn't really like that. He tells people to stop doing it every single time they do it. they decide basically together that the Manetheren banner and the wolf head, which are symbols of him and this kind of this distinct army group here, they make for a good way to hide in plain sight now against Massima, because this is technically kind of still in an area that could potentially be considered Manetheren, so it could be seen as like some sort of rebellion, like other like means of hiding in plain sight as something other than the Lord Dragon's army specifically. So, as far as like an entire warband is concerned, there seems to be some benefit to just going ahead and dealing with this thing rather than Perrin telling them to take the banner down every single day. So that's something that happens. Let's see, what's the other note that I have here? Yeah, they just make good for hiding in plain sight. That's all that said. Otherwise, the end of this chapter features a couple mini POVs over here. Actually, one of them, it might still be a parent POV. Either way, it switches to our first Zareen POV that wasn't in the prologue in Lord of Chaos. I think this is the first direct POV she's had other than that so far in the series. And I would say this showing was actually pretty interesting. Definitely really revealed a lot about her dynamic with him and what she's planning, things that she's doing that are a little bit surprising. At first I was like, so why are we having a Zareen POV? Like, these two kind of seem like more or less in lockstep to some degree, at least as far as like being physically together. So why is it that we're having like two separate POVs with these two? And this POV kind of explains why. Apparently Zareen has a group of followers that are inherently loyal to her, who have sworn to her personally as kind of a separate entity from Perrin. And so even though basically all of Zareen's intentions like kind of line up with Perrin's, there's obviously a little bit of, like direct loyalty to her here that she wanted to have. So she has like a small group of followers that exist in this vein. Some of these followers she had sent to Bethel as well, aside from Barrelane and the other two that accompanied Barrelane going into the city, so that her followers could gain information about Bethel. She learns from some of the people that had been part of that group that Alejandre is essentially barely maintaining control of the people of Bethel, and that the city is in very low spirits on account of like kind of harassment from the prophet and not really having any way to fight back, to such a degree that they essentially say that if the prophet were to come and contest the city itself, that the people guarding the city would probably just give it directly to him without any resistance, because what else are they going to do at that point? So that kind of gives you a situation of how hopeless the condition is in Bethel, and that will come up again pretty soon, probably in the next chapter, maybe in 2 chapters. I forget off the top of my head, but that's what happens. The other last POV in this chapter is that Morgase's group knows that Morgase is no longer the queen now. It's noted that apparently Linny kind of revealed that Morgase forsook her title. So now you have Talonvor, who's one of the companions of the group, wishing to pursue a relationship with Morgase, which is a little bit weird to some degree because apparently there's a not insubstantial age gap between them. Talonvor tells her that choosing to be a servant of Zareen won't allow her to affect change on the world. Like, she still wants to be able to affect change on the world despite the fact that she's not a queen anymore. So like there's a little bit of like personal and political tensions that are inherent to this. Morgase both acknowledges and denies this fact. Like, she still wants to do that, but we get a little very minor POV in here from Morgase, which, gotta say, coming out of Crown of Swords, I said at the end of that book, and I had said the same thing in Lord of Chaos as well, that one of my big disappointments with both of those books was that it didn't seem like there was enough Morgase's POV. Like, I wanted there to be a little bit more development there, a little bit more of that story development. And I gotta say, I was not anticipating when Perrin and co. came over to the west of the world in the last book that these two groups would meet together. So for these 2 chapters to kind of have this, this I don't know, this grouping, I guess I'll say, this actual convergence of these 2 storylines, putting the Morgase POV into something that's a little bit more substantial, with a little bit more POV allocation like Perrin, even though that's not necessarily saying very much, because there was a solid 3 entire books there where Perrin like existed for maybe a total of 15% of that runtime at most, and like maybe not even that much. So for being a tavern, you would think he would have a little bit more important role in the story, but again, I wasn't anticipating this convergence here, and I think it's kind of a good one to have one of the more major side plots and Perrin's main plot, but also seems to be more or less a side plot at the same time, like kind of there in the middle combined, I think is probably going to be good for both these storylines. I've heard from one person in particular that apparently there's like a situation in which like this convergence leads to something bad, like not necessarily bad in the story, but like is not good. Like there's some legitimately bad material in the book later because of it or something like that. And maybe that's true. I don't know yet. But considering how much I've enjoyed the book up to this point and the fact that I think that it's probably a good thing that these two POVs converge, we'll see what happens. I have no idea how that's going to go forward. I could be proven wrong, but again, I'm cautiously optimistic about this stuff. But now we're going to talk about chapter 9, which was a little bit of a less eventful chapter. I would say like this was the one chapter here in the POV section where I was like, we didn't need all of this. We could have cut this a little bit. Chapter could have been, I don't know, somewhere around half as long as it actually was, and you wouldn't have really cut out very much material, if any. So chapter 9 sees Perrin waking to the weather seemingly being notably cooler. I guess this is the next day, if I'm not mistaken. So you already start to see a little bit of the effects of the Bull of the Winds there. So a couple chapters later, you get that note in there, which is good. Perrin handles, some of the business about the camp, including like kind of explaining to a couple of people in particular why he has not had the Manetheren banner and the wolf head taken down like he normally would, which seems to be, something not enlightening. That's not the right term, but let's say lightens the attitudes of some of his army, because they're otherwise been told to stop calling him Lord, stop displaying this stuff all the time, pretty constantly, maybe every day or something like that. So for Perrin now to have gone a couple of days now, like the entire previous evening when he returned to the camp, and now, this whole day at this point, not telling people to take it down, people were like, we can have the banners up, this is cool, and like, that kind of effect on things going on. Perrin also learns a little bit of information in this moment from Bauer, who is, of course, a part of Morgase's crew, the one that kind of took them out of... What was the city? What was the city that got ransacked? Amador. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was Amador that they escaped from, that Shanchan invaded in A Crown of Swords, that they escaped from because of Bauer. Bauer offers Perrin some information, offers to be like a sort of secretary to him, offer him the information that he knows, and of course, being a spy master, being, somebody who dug into information for the White Cloaks previously to Pedron Nile. He obviously like knows some stuff, and he tells Perrin some things, and Perrin's like, I'm not sure how much I believe this information, but I'll keep you in mind, kind of thing, to satisfy Bauer. But I anticipate that Perrin's going to end up using him and using his information a good bit because of some of his information being revealed to be true a little bit later that Perrin notes in his mind. But the rest of chapter 9 basically just has Perrin seeing the Wise Ones regarding some controversy about how they're handling the Aes Sedai that they have kind of amongst the camp, because I think Rand had asked them to, put the Aes Sedai as like apprentices of the Wise Ones to kind of keep them in line to some degree. And obviously the behaviors of the Aiel are still kind of a little bit weird to the Wetlanders, and the way that they're treating the Aes Sedai specifically is coming off as like really strange to much of the camp, and the camp doesn't really like it. Like I said, it's kind of a controversy the way that they're handling that a bit. So Perrin finally decides that he's going to confront the Wise Ones about it, because his people don't really like it very much for obvious reasons. The Wise Ones just tell him that it's not his concern, and the Aes Sedai who are involved in this situation kind of ask him to stay out of it as well. The Aiel also in this moment tell Perrin that Massima must be killed, because apparently some of the Dreamwalkers, some of the other Wise Ones, kind of communicated that Dreamwalkers of the Aiel know that Massima is a direct danger to Rand to some capacity, so There's some interesting, potential political tension happening there that we'll see probably come to fruition at some point. But that's basically all that chapter 9 did. I spent nearly an hour reading for something that could have definitely been packed into like a 35-minute chapter maximum. So I thought that chapter was a little bit bloated, but was like pretty much the only major like pacing or other like really notable blemish during the parent section here. And that's a good thing that there wasn't very much for me to complain about there. Chapter 10 has some really good material and also a tiny bit of confusing material. I guess like the other blemish on this POV section is that chapter 10 sees the return of Elias, the wolf brother from Eye of the World, who kind of introduced Perrin to this idea that like, oh yeah, you're a wolf brother, by the way, and then dips and just doesn't come back again. He comes back in this book, which at first was kind of cool and was looking like it was going to be a good conversation, but then it just becomes like a real like nothing burger of a situation. Like he just kind of shows up out of nowhere here. And apparently he's now acquainted with Gaul as well, one of the Aiel who's like relatively close to Perrin, like as close to Perrin as any of the Aiel are. Elias gives Perrin some like strange advice about how to handle Saldaean women, because of course Perrin's wife Zareen is Saldaean. So like there's a little bit of a weird like relationship advice, quote unquote, aspect here that was like, it didn't really need that. It didn't really do anything. It didn't feel like it actually served any purpose. It's just more that kind of relationship drama stuff that I don't enjoy about the Perrin POVs. It just kind of existed. And the fact that this was like all that Elias did in this chapter and then like disappears and doesn't appear again is like, I don't know, maybe he's somewhere else in this book or something and maybe he's important, I don't know. But if like this is all that we get from him showing back up in the series 7 books later, that's lame. It's not even like necessarily that it's bad, because I've had people tell me or had people say and posit a lot that like Elias's reappearance here in this book, in this chapter, is like one of the worst things of the series. Like, oh, he just comes back to give Perrin really terrible relationship advice. And I'm like, well, yeah, viewing it through that angle, that's not great, but I don't think it's bad inherently so much as it is just super lame. If that was only a small portion of a much longer and much more impactful conversation that Elias and Perrin had together in the chapter, I would not really care that much about the supposed relationship advice. I'd be like, I didn't really need that part, but who cares? We got this cool conversation, this cool interaction. Otherwise, it was like, that's it. I just kind of feel gypped that was all that came from this character appearing again, because I was really excited when he just appeared again. So like that's a little bit lame, a little bit disappointing, but alas, we move on. That happened. That was a thing that happened in this chapter. Some other things that happened in this chapter see Berelain return with the Queen Alliandre herself here to size up Perrin personally, because, Alliandre doesn't want to, make a partnership with somebody who she can't size up to some degree, and because Rand isn't really available to like actually negotiate with. She's like, Perrin will have to do for this. Perrin is basically Rand's his I guess his proxy. Perrin is Rand's proxy in this moment, so she came to size him up herself. And after this interaction, a little bit of interactions with Perrin, you see a little bit of the effect of Perrin's Tavern here, and you don't often get to see the effects of Perrin's Tavern besides the implicit like, oh, he controls a big army even though he's super insecure. You actually get to see a moment of her deciding to swear fealty to Perrin, and thus by proxy Rand saying that they are her only hope for saving Ghealdan, the entire nation, which really puts into perspective just how much of a nuisance the prophet kind of is on her people and on the city and on the area at large. So that puts things into perspective. It is also learned in this sort of sequence of events that the Shan-Chan have invaded Ebu Dar now rather than just Amador, and that the prophet is indeed where Balor said he might. That was kind of one of the bits of information that Perrin got from Balor before, was suggesting that, oh, the prophet's probably in this specific location, and Perrin was like, I don't know if I trust that information. How do you know that? And Balor's like, oh, well, I have these these little bits of knowledge, so I was able to put two and two together and figure out like that's probably where he is. Perrin's like, okay, and in this moment, it being revealed otherwise that is in fact where he is, Alejandra just straight up says like, yeah, that's where he is right now. Perrin's like, okay, so Bauer was right. Maybe there's actually something up with Bauer that I should probably, check out and get a hold of and track, whatever else. So that happens. We get to, I will say, just kind of, inputting my opinion here. I liked this scene, this moment between Perrin and Alejandra was really, really great. You get to see like Perrin's inherent skill at stuff, despite his POV's assurance in himself that he's not actually good at it. I think that Jordan actually does a pretty good job with Perrin's internal dichotomy, using him as a vessel to view the world in a different way from other characters, but also the way that he views himself as inherently different from other characters. And if you as the reader kind of view that from other characters' perspectives, like, oh, these other characters view Perrin in this way, even though Perrin does not view himself in that way, you're able to see that and have those things interact inherently through Perrin's own internal narration that is like really effective, even though it's not explicitly on the page. It's actually really good. And one of the reasons why, even though Perrin's not my favorite character anymore, one of the reasons why he was my favorite character at the beginning of the series, and why I still really like his character, usually when Zareen isn't an inherently like forefront thing in his life at any given moment in time, but like just as a political and a leader character and all these kind of stuff, this vessel to view the world in different interesting ways, I really like Perrin. A great character, even if he's being kind of fumbled and mishandled in certain degrees, but I really enjoyed this interaction. That was really cool. But otherwise, you get to see the rest of chapter 10 move into another Zareen POV, and this one was also good. Zareen has a ward set by one of the Aes Sedai around so that, no eavesdropping can really occur, because Perrin goes to go investigate something somewhere else. Yeah, he goes to the Mayene part of the camp to kind of investigate something that's been brought up to his attention, and Zareen's like, okay, this is my moment to talk to Alejandra personally. So she does that. She sets a ward against eavesdropping, or rather has a ward set against eavesdropping put up so that she can meet privately with the queen, and manages to coerce her through supreme political maneuvering into agreeing to go with Perrin to confront the prophet, because it's kind of been determined like Perrin kind of needs to confront the prophet directly at this point, because that's the only way he's going to be able to catch him off guard. It's like, go to him, find him, sneak up on him, and confront him right then and there, rather than, this like sneaking and hiding about and letting the prophet come to him, which could be detrimental or something along those lines. Or at least that's kind of like the implicit suggestions being made. Zareen manages to coerce the queen into going with Perrin to be another kind of like political tool in this. Like the reason why Zareen and Perrin agreed that like keeping the wolf head and the Manetheren banner up is probably a good thing to hide in plain sight. She's now using Queen Alejandra to, be part of this maneuvering, to be part of this setup, to, maybe hide in plain sight and approach Massima from like a sort of different angle than it actually is. Like this isn't from the Dragon Reborn angle, this is from the Queen angle or something. I don't think I got precisely all of the details of it, but either way, like very impressive political maneuvering. You get to see a little bit of that background of Zareen, like having grown up, in a household and in a place where she would implicitly know a lot of this stuff better than, definitely a lot better than Perrin would. So you get to see her maneuvering, not necessarily behind Perrin's back, but also behind Perrin's back at the same time. There's an interesting dynamic there that could be explored to good effect. We'll see if that happens, but could be. And I just think it was really cool. Like, good moment for her to be able to do this. And then Zareen is also criticized by Berylane, during this moment, like during this like sort of scene, this POV, I guess, Berylane criticizes Zareen for, some of her new servants that she's picked up kind of being maybe not the best servants objectively, one of them being Morgay specifically. So there's that. That's something that I wrote down, but doesn't necessarily pertain to the chapter too much at this point. I'm sure it'll become a thing a little bit later, and that's why it's being noted, but we'll see. the next part of this chapter, the final portion of the Perrin POV section here, is Perrin's POV actually at the end of the chapter, going to the main camp. Like I said, he's going off to do. He finds that the main camp has captured 7 of the Prophet's men over here, who, capturing them after having burned some farmers in their estate. So having burned a farm section with, the people still there. He has those people hanged. So that was certainly a moment where you get to see that Perrin's kind of executing upon the sort of laws and whatnot that Rand would probably do. And also because, you don't just murder people for no reason, actually. That's not a good thing. So that's something that he has done. Also, all through all of these chapters, I should note that Perrin, up to this point, basically all of the chapters have had Perrin seemingly hearing a distant thunder that he can't quite tell is thunder, but that's kind of hard to tell about. Rather indistinct, we'll say, just this kind of thing been going on for a little while, and it's the end of this chapter here where that culminates in a little mini storm of sorts, a little brief thunderstorm that passes over the group here in this moment, proving that the weather is sort of starting to change. So you get to see this continuing on as we go along as well. So yeah, that is chapters 7 through 10, which means that I still have 4 more chapters to go through, and this video is already probably 40 minutes long or something like that. I'm going to die if this video is over an hour long, and I'm absolutely certain it's going to be over an hour long. Okay, so because of a very particular dynamic that I do want to talk about regarding Rand's POV here, I am actually going to talk about chapters 11 and 12 right now, and then do chapters 13 and 14 after that, instead of switching the order of this, because of a dynamic that we'll talk about later when we get through this. So chapters 11 and 12 were surprisingly great chapters. These are more miscellaneous POV type stuff. So, every once in a while in these Wheel of Time books, you kind of have a little interlude section often where, you have a full chapter of miscellaneous POVs, or maybe even a couple chapters of just a small handful of POVs, showing you stuff from other parts of the world that are still important, I would call them tertiary plots personally. Stuff that are still important to know, important developments, or things that reveal things that you should probably need to know, and that kind of material without being one of the main POVs. So chapters 11 and 12 are basically just this kind of thing. We have 4 POVs to talk about within these 2 chapters. Chapter 11 is pretty self-contained. Both these POVs are telling one kind of storyline. It's, jumping back to the Shaido Aiel. So if we recall from A Crown of Swords, kind of jumping back to that again, that whole plot line with the Shaido Aiel ends with Samael and Graendal giving the Shaido travel boxes, which they can't actually do anything with, that may or may not do anything at all, because Samael seems to have been suggested to have been the one to actually open the gateways that all these, Aiel walked through, some of them to be ambushed and basically murdered to cause chaos, and others to be sent elsewhere. So, you have the group of Savannah and various other wise ones that have been sent through, and they have no idea where any of their other warriors are. They kind of have to find them at this point, because they've learned that the travel boxes very evidently do not work, or at least do not work in any way that they can use them. But yeah, so you have a start of the Shaido wise ones here, and it turns out they're in a pretty similar part of the world as well. I forget where directly here actually. Yeah, I don't recall if it says where this is. It's sort of somewhere in that same region, kind of that Amadicia, Galen, Altara range. Don't know precisely where, but it's somewhere there in that sort of southwest, or west-ish southern region. If there's a specific location of this that's identifiable, I'm sorry I forgot about it, or that I didn't realize that there was one. But either way, this particular POV happens down, I think, vaguely in this sort of region. The Shaido Wise Ones are interrogating some Shan-Chan riders. This is part of the reason why I think it's somewhere in that kind of Amadicia range, because they're talking with Shan-Chan riders, learning a small amount about them because they've captured a small party of them that were kind of like roaming about after having just taken Amador. So presumably this is in Amadicia. It could be like somewhere else more specifically, but like that's kind of the region that I think is implied by this. But you have these wise ones questioning some of the Shan-Chan. The Shan-Chan seem to be revealing like some information, going so far as to say that there could be hundreds of thousands of more Shan-Chan coming to the continent to, do whatever it is that they've come to do, reinstate the reign of Arthur Hawkwing or whatever, even though Arthur Hawkwing's long dead. So Shan-Chan stuff, just typical Shan-Chan things. But you have these questionings that go revealing this kind of information. The wise ones kind of all determine amongst each other in this moment that there can't possibly be hundreds of thousands more coming to the continent, because they can hardly like conceptualize an ocean in the first place, let alone crossing an entire ocean to get from some ancient other place where Arthur Hawkwing used to be to this continent. That seems completely far-fetched to them. Most of the wise ones seem to be pretty opposed to Savannah as a rule, is a point that this entire discussion kind of seems to imply as well throughout the chapter. Let's see, there's other things that happen here, including like a brotherless, which I forget what a brotherless actually stands for, brotherless, in here. I know I wrote that down because I thought I would remember what that actually is, but for some reason I'm forgetting. A brotherless asks for judgment regarding the shares of loot of the place they have ransacked not far from Amador. So yeah, they're not far from Amador. That's how I remembered the region. Savannah lets the others go to pass judgment. Yeah, I forget exactly what the brotherless is. It's something to do. Oh, that's what it is. It's some of the Aiel who have kind of like abandoned their own sept, their own clan, essentially to come like join this group that's been here because their initial clans or septs chose to follow Rand, and they didn't believe that Rand was the Karn, or Aiel type of prophecy stuff in here. The brotherless are the ones who abandoned their own sept to kind of like join another, so they're not treated quite the same way. In this moment, you just have a scene of a brotherless asking for judgment regarding the shares of the loot from a place that they ransacked, because apparently they're not sharing any of the loot with the brotherless, and Savannah's kind of the idea that the brotherless like should get a little bit of something, but she's like, no, I'll just have all the other wise ones deal with this, and goes about her merry way. That's something that happens. I don't know if that's important, but it is something that happens here in the scene. There's also a side note that I wrote down that all of the wise ones agree that Kadar Samael duped them because of like the travel boxes and stuff like that, which is a good thing that they'll never meet up again because Samael's dead. But yeah, they kind of all agree on that point. But you shift at this point to another POV for chapter 11, where you're returning to Galina once again, the Aes Sedai, who I believe was head of the Red Aja for a solid amount of time, and has been like essentially the leader of like the Black Aja Council for a solid amount of time as well, for like a very large amount of her time being Aes Sedai. Like there were specific numbers given to that at the end of Crown of Swords when she had a POV there. I forget the numbers, but needless to say, she's red/black. But Galina is being tortured by some of the wise ones in this scene for having slapped one of the wise ones specifically. It's kind of an act of defiance, and she's being shown like, you do not do that, especially not as a despised here. So she's hanging over a fire, kind of cooking from the inside out over it, until Savannah arrives, displaying the oath rod given by Samael to her, which seems to be similar enough to an actual oath rod to actually work, unlike the travel boxes. She basically asks Galina to make an oath for her, and Galina says like, yes, I'll make an oath for you, just like free me from this torment right now. Not having realized at that point, at that making that promise, like I'll make an oath to you, that Savannah had an oath rod. So when Savannah reveals the oath rod, Galina is like, oh crap, this doesn't work for me actually, because I can't swear fealty to I can't promise to serve Savannah here and then backstab her, because like that kind of doesn't really work with the oath rod. But there are some other wise ones that also show up at this moment, adjusting the deal with the oath rod, having discovered like, oh, you have an oath rod, don't think that you're going to use that, or that you're going to be able to use that and make Galina only obey you. We're actually going to make her promise to obey all of the wise ones even if foremost among those is Savannah, and also by agreement, another one of them called Tharava, who Galina seems to have like a really strong aversion to Tharava, like cannot deal with her at all, like is absolutely terrified of her for some reason. I forget if it's specified why, but it's definitely there that she's like really, really not a fan of Tharava, so that the fact that she has to obey all of the wise ones, but Savannah and Tharava specifically foremost amongst all of them, is not a great deal for Galina, and she loses hope essentially in this moment. All of her hopes for escape are crushed in this moment because she wanted to be able to like swear fealty to Savannah and then be able to backstab her or something like that, but with the Oath Rod can't really do that, so her hopes of escaping that way are crushed. It's actually kind of a pitiful and arguably depressing moment to witness Galina here. It's almost enough to make you laugh, but it's also kind of sad as well. And also important to note here at the end of the chapter is that the entire group kind of witnesses a pretty brief and pitiful, albeit pitiful, bout of snow come over top them, but that's something that also happens. Again, another signal that the weather is changing a good bit, and surprisingly rapidly. For example, chapter 12 moves us into a completely different category of POVs, starting off with Graendal personally, who has apparently looted some of Samael's belongings from Ilion to a degree because, after killing Samael, Rand and everybody's kind of been in Ilion, so Graendal hasn't really had a lot of opportunity to actually be there, but she has snuck out some things from Samael's belongings there. She is also continuing to do what she's been doing, what she was doing with Samael as well, in sowing chaos in the world by kind of directing orders from certain people in certain regions to do things that those people aren't actually ordering. So like, typical Forsaken chaos stuff here. That's what Graendal's doing in this moment. She is interrupted in the middle of doing this stuff by a couple of the other Forsaken. So one of these is Moghedien, and another one named, I guess it's Sindane. I'm just going to call her Sindane. If not, it's probably Sindane or something like that. I don't know. But these two Forsaken interrupt Graendal here, and they're basically coming to make Graendal submit to Moradin as Nablis. They reveal that Moradin is now the Nablis, and Graendal's like, who is this Moradin? Why do I have to submit to him? And, all that kind of stuff. But a couple things that I did want to note is that Sindane, at first I was like really confused. I was like, who is this person? Like, who is this Forsaken? This doesn't really make sense. What's going on here? Because there was a little bit of time where I was like, well, this could be Arengar, but then I was like, well, no, it's not Arengar, because she very clearly uses Saidar, so she can't be, a male. She can't have been a male revived in a female's body, because this Sindane is very clearly a female body, like apparently a pretty gorgeous one, I guess, but uses Saidar, so it can't be Arengar. But then I was like, well, can it be Osengar, the other one, the counter? But I could be wrong on this. I might be misremembering Osengar specifically. I feel like I recall Osengar being the opposite of Arengar, being a female revived in a male's body. I don't know if that's actually the case, but I think these two are kind of opposites of each other in that way. Again, I could totally be wrong about that, but either way, I'm pretty sure Sindane's not Osengar. So I'm sitting here like, well, what other Forsaken have died that are female and that apparently were revived female? Who could this be? And I'm inclined to think it might be, what's her name? Selene. The one that is killed by Moraine, or killed with Moraine at the end of Fires of Heaven. What's her name? I always forget her actual name for some reason, her Forsaken name. Lanfear, that's the name. Lanfear. I'm assuming that Sindane is Lanfear. That's just kind of a theory in my head, I guess. I don't really have any evidence to back this up, besides maybe like general attitude and temperament, and the idea that she's really beautiful, and obviously a woman who's actually wielding the woman half of the one power, so very clearly would have had to be a woman revived into a woman if she is indeed one of the revived Forsaken. So that's my assumption of who she is. But either way, Sindane and Moghedien have come to make Graendal submit to Moradin as the Nablis, just as Moghedien was forced to do that, which I guess raises questions to... Oh, no, never mind. That was Shaidar Haran. Never mind. That's a completely different thing. So we'll go ahead and stop talking about that now. Grendel kind of doubts and resists. Like I said, she has no reason to believe, like, why is Moradin Nablis already? This seems pretty unbelievable. I don't really trust you people all of a sudden. But Shadar Haran himself, the actual Fade, the Myrddraal, right-hand man, essentially, of the Dark One himself, arrives now in this moment, which is a really chilling sequence, actually. This scene was, like, super, super effective. I'll say, like, really, really good. Grendel chooses to submit on account of Shadar Haran basically scaring the piss out of her, not least by saying, like, yeah, I'm speaking with the Dark One's voice right now. Like, maybe not necessarily saying that thing, but, like, whatever I say, you can trust this comes from the Dark One himself. You will submit, basically, is what he says to her, and says, like, don't forget my name, Don't forget that you are still subject to the Dark One. So Grendel does decide to submit in this moment for pretty obvious reasons, even though she still kind of has her own plots going on. But she's going along with the orders for now that she has to submit to Moradin. So that's very good scene. Like, I actually really enjoyed the scene. I also enjoyed the next scene, which takes us not to another Forsaken POV, but to an Aes Sedai POV, specifically Cadsuane. The weather has started to visibly affect Carrion here. I believe it's like actually like legitimately raining in Carrion in this scene, so you get to see further effects of the weather here. Cadsuane arrives in Carrion to try to learn a little bit more about Rand. Apparently she's been questioning and kind of like trying to talk to various other Aes Sedai and other people to like learn as much as she can about Rand to some degree, like where Rand is, what's going on right now, because he kind of just disappeared again at the end of A Crown of Swords to go just kill Samael off of just, on a whim, basically. Cadsuane has some of the Aes Sedai go to those sworn to him to get kind of information to report back. I don't think any of that has kind of been revealed at this point, or at least if it was, I don't remember the information specifically. But Cadsuane does summon and talk with Alanna about Rand, because she, of course, knows that Alanna had bonded Rand. There's a little bit of contention about that particular point here as well. The only information through her that we get revealed by Alanna is that he is probably an alien. That's all that Alanna can really say. It's like, at this kind of distance, he could be in Tyr for all I know, but he's probably an alien, just kind of based off of the direction. She also reveals that Rand had been healed to some degree, so that everything aside from like those kind of permanent gut wounds, the ones, caused by, Shadar Logoth and the Padan Fane's dagger from the last book as well. So like this kind of like double gut wound that he has is the only thing that like wasn't healed. So he's had some healing while he's been away as well. That some just discussions about where Rand is. That's all that Cadsuane really learns in this moment. Sorelei also comes and dismisses Alanna in here, and both Sorelei and Cadsuane, as a wise one of the Aiel and a very, like, I guess you could say feared, a very well respected, but feared might be a better word, one of these Aes Sedai who's pretty old, pretty legendary figure amongst the Aes Sedai. These two come to some level of understanding and agreement with each other here at the end of the chapter about making sure that Rand kind of like humanizes himself, like that he's making himself he's hardening himself in the wrong way. He's like kind of making himself to be potentially too brittle, too easy to break. Even though like leaders kind of have to be hard to some degree, like so that they can do a leading job, especially when it comes to war and battle. It's hard to do that kind of thing if you're a soft person. So Rand is very obviously trying to avoid being soft, but these two come to an agreement that Rand is kind of going about this the wrong way to a certain degree, and that he needs to like soften himself a bit, that he needs to humanize himself a bit, that he needs to feel emotions, because him being too dehumanized, too disconnected from that part of his soul, it could be just as bad for the world as, losing the last battle. That if he goes into the last battle in that kind of manner, that it could just be a bad thing, that he still needs to be a person and be able to feel person things. So that was an interesting agreement for them to come to. Sorelei, as kind of, but both of them kind of like offer information to each other. They come to an agreement about this. They make an agreement. Sorelei shows Cadsuane the weave for traveling, because apparently she learned how to do this, even though she can't really do it. She was able to show Cadsuane the weave itself, so that Cadsuane now essentially knows how to travel, which is, I guess we'll see how that goes and what that actually does in the future of the series. Cadsuane kind of repays her by making a water oath for Sorelei. So like that's kind of the negotiations, the discussion that those two have. Very interesting moments, I gotta say. Quite good stuff. Like I really enjoyed chapters 11 and 12. Thought they were super solid, like genuinely super solid. And again, like kind of going back to what I was saying at the beginning of this video, I think that basically everything I read this week was good to great, like really good to great. Genuinely fantastic stuff, and like that hasn't even touched these two Rand chapters, which I will admit were a little bit slower, you know, kind of in the same way that other things have been, but I think these two are slower both as a reaction to what just happened at the end of A Crown of Swords, to what Rand did, but most primarily in preparation for what Rand is going to do because he now controls Ilion. These two chapters are really great. Fortunately, chapter 13 didn't have a whole lot of meat to it. Chapter 14 did. But yeah, moving into these last couple chapters, we are in Rand's POV again, if just for a couple chapters, but we get some good stuff here. At the start of chapter 13, Rand is in Ilion again, obviously, confronted with an army of Samaels, because apparently Samael had organized and had a battle ready to go, or an army ready to go, maybe in case he died, or something along these lines, because Rand's in Ilion and like, I gotta kind of do something about this army. He wishes to give, you know, like kind of the leaders of this army of Samaels his terms being to either join his army or to lay down their arms straight up, and probably if they don't do either, theoretically, or I would guess implicitly, you could probably assume that he would intend to kill them if they do not do either, because that would suggest that they mean to stand against him, and he can't be having that. You know, so some of the nobles of Ilion and Ter, you know, some of the other people that have been with him, you know, for a while. You have the Terran nobles that have been with him. You have now the Ilion Council that obviously submits to him now as the new king, because the previous king has kind of disappeared, presumably killed by Samael. They don't wish for Rand to go meet with them directly because he's obviously their king now. They don't want him to just like kind of go and put himself in direct danger. Rand ultimately decides to take a couple of Ilion's, you know, council members, their, you know, leadership heads with him, as well as some Ashaman and a pretty substantial amount of an army to lay his terms out to the army, because he's insistent about laying out these terms in person. Rand notes that Lews Therin has yet remained absent for a while, but gives his terms to the army, says, yeah, lay down your arms, just don't do any battle, like completely give up the fight, or join my army, or you're probably going to die, is basically what's going to go on there. That's all that happens in chapter 13. Like, not really much to go on there, but that's what happens. Chapter 14, however, has a little bit more going on relative to its length. Both of these were rather short chapters, but this one was pretty packed with some stuff. So, upon returning to Ilion, I guess, or after this meeting, whatever, wherever the actual setting is, doesn't really matter that much. Rand returns to his camp, basically, wherever his armies and stuff are, to find that, I think I have that written down wrong. Yeah, Torval, that's the name. For some reason, I have a typo in my notes in here. Rand returns to camp to find Torval, a Black Tower messenger sent to him by, you know, Taim, just kind of revealing information to him. The note says that there are around 450 Ashaman now enrolled in the tower, that around 50 of them have died or burned out, or that around 50 people have died or burned out up to this point, with 10 of those people who've died or burned out being as a result of madness. So basically being, you know, mercy killed because they went mad all of a sudden. So like, that's a pretty significant number. Taim's pretty proud of it. He says like, oh, I'll have enough to make, you know, the White Tower blush in like however many months or something like that. Rand, you know, thinks to himself about how like that doesn't actually make much of a difference to him, because, you know, just having that many people doesn't really make up for having many years of experience like everybody in the White Tower does. But that is something that Taim does tell Rand. Torval also tells Rand about a large amount of Aes Sedai heading to the tower, heading, you know, vaguely in the direction of the Black Tower, which is something that we get to explore a little bit, starting off with the next next week's reading, stuff that I've already started to read a little bit about, which is, the first 5 chapters of next week's reading are Gwen's POV. So you get to start to see a little bit of what that is going on there, but that isn't for this week's video. Rand says that they aren't actually heading towards the Black Tower. They're heading to Camelin specifically, and not to be disturbed unless provoked. Basically, do not disturb the Aes Sedai unless they provoke you, like, explicitly. So, like, don't cause any battle or anything like this. I had written in my notes here, I'm guessing these Aes Sedai are the Egwene plot line to come in the next 5 chapters, question mark. It seems like that I was basically right on that, because I've read the first 3 chapters of that plot line now, and that's basically what it is, because there was a meeting between them. Anyway, that's all next week's stuff, so we won't get into that now. Either way, another person as well, another Black Tower initiate, another male user named Moore, who was, I guess, sent out to kind of like scout out some stuff regarding the Shan-Chan, returns as well in this moment to say that the Shan-Chan are planning to move against Ilion next, and through, some deductive reasoning, they're able to find out that, like, yeah, Moore's, like, telling the truth about this. They're coming to Ilion next, almost certainly. So Rand kind of has to begin planning how to keep them from moving out of Altara, out of Ebu Dar, because they also learn in that moment that not only did they invade Amador, that they also took Ebu Dar as well. He has some thoughts about that, but his essential plans at this point are, well, I've got to keep them from moving out of Altara. Like, they can't invade Ilion. I'm not going to let that happen. And he has to basically destroy them to whatever degree that he is able to. That is the stakes of the chapter. And speaking of stakes, like, I've actually got to say, Robert Jordan has done a very good job of letting the stakes of, various different conflicts and battles and stuff match along with Rand's growing power pretty well. It's been very interesting to follow that kind of stuff. Super excited to see how that continues. Like, I've heard that he's basically on the level of being effectively a demigod by, the last few books. So if you're already starting to see how that could definitely be the case here, Path of Daggers, I'm like, well, based off of the stuff he's going to have to do, like, he's got to be a pretty powerful son of a gun to be able to do any of this stuff. But that is the intent. That's kind of what's going on there. Rand begins planning how to keep them from moving out of Altara there. Moore also mentions in this chapter that Saidin has been acting a little bit weird around Ebu Dar, which is, I think, pretty clearly meant to be thanks to the Bull of the Winds. He also comments about how the taint is a little bit worse regarding Saidin, just kind of the disturbingness of having to touch it, having to use it. Rand muses on this point a little bit, kind of considering how it is that he would like to be able to get rid of the taint, some ideas that he has that could maybe see that work. Apparently, he accidentally muses on some of this stuff out loud, some of the stuff out loud, just kind of based on the reaction of some of the other people around him. He also considers that, like, he's maybe puzzled this out, that he's maybe figured this out to a degree that maybe Herod Fell had also figured out before he was killed, apparently by, the Dark One to some degree, that maybe that was the thing that Herod Fell had meant to tell him before he died. And he's like, I think I have an idea of how to get rid of the taint, and I'm going to have to try to do something along those lines. Rand makes some orders for various peoples to do various things, kind of preparing the war against the Shan-Chan. But the other thing that really ends this chapter is that Lews Therin actually comes back again after being absent for a little while. His voice speaks again and basically agrees with Rand. It's just like, no, I think your idea for getting rid of the taint is a good one. We don't know what that idea is, but, these characters obviously do. And Rand seems to sort of rejoice at the fact that Lews Therin has come back, but maybe not. Like, very weird, complicated dynamic between those two, but that was kind of a funny moment. What I gotta say is that I really enjoyed this little bit. It seems to just be kind of a couple chapters of setup, specifically for, like I said a little bit later, I think this book is going to have some pretty big moments with Rand and the Shan-Chan coming up in, like, I guess the final act, but mostly like the back half of the book, whatever it is that I have coming up. I think I have a couple more chapters of Egwene where I'm currently at reading, IRL at the time of recording this video. I think there's like 3 Rand POVs that come after this little section. No, there's 2 more Egwene, there's an Elaine chapter, and then I think it's 3 Rand chapters, if I'm not mistaken. And that's what I'm supposed to read through for next week. I think my plan is to discuss chapters 15 through 23 in next week's video. And I think that will be following 3 pretty major chapters from Rand's POV. So I'm looking forward to what happens there. But I do want to note something about Rand that I didn't get to from the text explicitly here. One of the things that I found to be interesting, remember how I talked about Cadsuane and Sorelei kind of agreeing with each other that Rand needs to like humanize himself a little bit. I found these couple chapters of Rand's POV to be super fascinating to immediately follow that, because you have Rand in his own head, in his POV, basically stating like, Steel, I have to be Steel, I have to be a leader, I have to be unfeeling, I have to do what is necessary to get done what needs to get done. And the way he describes himself, the way he comes off in the narrative, the way he comes off in the text and the narration is brittle. Like, you get the impression explicitly that he seems to be like a brittle, like he's going to snap at any moment. If something bends him too much in one direction, he could just completely lose it. Not necessarily in a sanity way, just in a like straight up existence way. Like, he could just completely lose everything just on account of shutting off all of the human emotions at all in himself, which goes along with the idea that, you know, the Wise One and the Aes Sedai agreed on was that he needs to not be doing this to himself, that he needs to be humanizing himself a little bit more, that he needs to be hard, that he needs to be someone willing and able to do what needs to be done without completely losing the human part of the soul that is, you know, kind of necessary to still be human. So there was a really interesting thing. I really liked being able to read those couple chapters immediately after that and be able to read into it and say, you know, like, they have a point. Rand feels distinctly different in these couple chapters. He feels like a much different person. Not necessarily because he is, but after having just, well, he didn't seem to directly kill Samael in the end of A Crown of Swords, but after that confrontation, you get the distinct impression that Rand is darker. He is definitely a little bit lower than he was before this, and I don't think that's on accident. I don't think that's just Robert Jordan deciding, oh, like, I'm going to get a little bit more dismal with this one, or I don't have a reason. Like, I think like Rand is just very clearly was here and is now just down a rung on that ladder. And I think that's very intentional for his characterization, and you feel that. You really, really feel that in these couple chapters. And again, having followed that chapter, that discussion just before that, and having these descriptions of Steel in Rand's POV here, it's like, this is going to be crazy. Like, the confrontation with Shan-Chan, that's almost certainly going to happen in this book. Like, there's going to be something that happens regarding that in this book. I'm fairly certain of that. I'm just really excited to see what it all does, because it's really cool build up. Really effective build up. Again, I really enjoyed my reading this past week, or at least for this week's video. Aside from a couple, you know, minor hiccups here and there, I think it's great. I think Path of Daggers is actually really good. I would say, like, you know, kind of wrapping things up now at this point, I would say my feelings on Path of Daggers are really surprising, in that despite some weird structural things, like I was talking about at the beginning with the first 6 chapters feeling like they should probably be something that should have been like cut a little bit, like shortened a little bit and put at the end of like A Crown of Swords or something, because it was still that plot line. It feels like it's holdover. It's not something that should be at the very beginning of a book like this. Aside from some of those weird structural things, judging this book just on the content that it contains, and especially on the content that it is working to set up, it's actually pretty good. I'm enjoying this a lot more than I think I have any right to, and just judging based on the content alone, I don't know, there's assuming the rest of this back half continues to be as enjoyable as like all of these chapters that I talked about this week were, and the chapters that I've already read for next week's video have been, I don't know, I could have a very unpopular opinion about where Path of Daggers places, even despite the weird structural stuff, just judging it on its own content. It's been pretty good so far. I'm definitely looking forward to continuing reading. In fact, at the time that I'm letting this video render, you know, I'm going to edit this pretty much immediately and let it render. I'm going to be reading another 1 to 2 chapters after that, and I think I'll be done with the 3rd week's worth of reading. Not by the time the first diary comes out, but like probably the next day, that Friday, I'll probably be done with the 3rd week's worth of reading, making that 3rd video. And who knows, I could be through this book before this video, this second diary, even comes out. If that's the case, that'll be like really cool. It'll be really helpful for me in sort of my freelance and my personal life. But I gotta say, really enjoying this one. Definitely looking forward to continue, not just the wariness that I had last week where I said, I don't know, the next few chapters seem to be parent stuff, and we'll see how I enjoy that. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed everything that came after that as well so far. This book's been surprisingly good, and I'm actually genuinely really happy that it has been surprisingly good. But I'm gonna go ahead and end the video there. I've been rambling a little bit. I said I would be pretty upset if this video got to be over an hour. I knew it would end up being over an hour. At this point, it's probably like an hour and 10 minutes or something like that. So it's up there with like the second or third longest diary in the series. Who would have thought that as the series goes on and gets into the slog books here, that the diaries would get longer than they were at the beginning of the series? Nobody guessed that would happen, least of all me, but I've just kind of structured things a little bit differently. I've been enjoying making the diaries more, even though they are longer, and I hope you've been enjoying watching as well. Sorry for hitting the mic there if that made any sound. But either way, like I said, I really appreciate you for watching. If you did, if you've been watching all of these diaries, if you watched any of these diaries, I appreciate it. Let me know what you thought about my thoughts on some of Path of Daggers so far. Don't spoil anything for the future of the book, even though I have been reading on, because, you know, theoretically there might be people who watch these videos who haven't actually read continuing on, so maybe don't do that. But once again, thank you guys for watching. To anybody and everybody who has watched this, I really, really, really appreciate it. Mean the world to me. I can't wait to have another couple episodes of this coming out, especially as I continue to work my way through the book and get those last couple videos done, probably before this video comes out once again. That'll be cool if that happens. But yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing this book, and then I'll be hitting, you know, Winter's Heart here in a couple of months, probably, maybe in June. We'll see what happens. I have some things going on the next couple months as far as work go that might make that impossible. I might have to delay Winter's Heart a little bit, which I honestly don't want to do. Once I'm finished with this, I might have to resist starting Winter's Heart because I have too much work that I need to get done besides, which is very surprising that I would feel that way about a Wheel of Time book, considering all the space that I've intentionally left between all the books. Anyway, I continue to ramble on like nothing else. I apologize for that. Thank you one final time for watching. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next diary next week, and in whatever other video I post beside.